We have several visitors here this morning, and what we've tried to do is we've tried to kind of take us back to our roots about what we're discussing each week. And I feel kind of compelled this morning, especially with visitors, to make a kind of a disclaimer this morning, if I could, or at least so that you feel comfortable about what we're dealing with this morning. As elders, Mark and I we have very long history. We've been Christians a long time. We've studied the scriptures intensely for many years. And we felt back in the fall that there would be a need for us as a congregation because we come from so many different backgrounds. This is a kind of a unique congregation from my standpoint. Some people from what we would consider to be the mainline churches of Christ, some from the very conservative elements, some from even the no Sunday school elements of the Church of Christ, that we thought it would be really good for us to really start talking about some of the things that we want to do and how it is that we work together and kind of lay a foundation for all of that. As a part of that, we decided that it would be important for us to really focus in on laying some groundwork and some foundation for those kinds of discussions because they're not always easy. And so that's what the purpose of this class is on Sunday morning. And I just don't want anybody to go, of some of the things that we're talking about, and just let you know, if you're visiting especially, that if you have any questions or concerns about anything that's said here, if you'll just feel free to talk with Mark and I about it. I mean, we're approachable, we're very open about this. There are a lot of different ways to view things, and we're certainly open to making sure that we're doing what's right and looking at the scriptures the right way. I hope I didn't overplay that hand, but I just want everyone to know that this is an open discussion. We're looking forward to how we can move together as a congregation and work together in unity. That is our number one goal. We have no intention of uniting all of the churches of Christ across the country. We have no intention of activating the church universal. Our goal is, as elders, is to make sure that every single one of us get ahead without getting behind, and that on the day of judgment, every single one of us can faithfully stand before the Lord and say, I tried to do my best. And that's really our goal. So there's a little bit about our heart in this. So to open our discussion this morning, just so you'll know where we are, we're actually talking about our history and who we are. And we started with an overview of just religious history from the beginning of mankind, from Adam all the way up to 2018. And what did we find out about man's tendency in regards to religious matters? What is man's inclination?
Do their own thing. Just keep splitting.
Yeah, do what we want and split. That seems to be the history. And what's interesting is in every huge milepost throughout man's history, starting with the flood, and then with the giving of the law, and then with the coming of Christ, and even today, what we find is that there seems to be a larger group of people who are kind of doing their own thing, but there's always this small, not necessarily a group, but individuals, there are always these people who are trying to serve God and are faithful to God, no matter what. In the midst of all of the hubbub and all the confusion and all of the degradation, there are these few, seems like we see through history, these few. Noah was one, Moses, Abraham, these few, Mary, these few that were trying to do what was right. And we call them the what? Yeah, the remnant. But there's always this remnant. No matter what we see in history, there's always this remnant of people who are trying to be faithful. And that's what I want to be. I think that's what you want to be. And so we talked to some about the religious history of mankind, and then we went back and started a couple of weeks ago talking about church history. What's happened to Christianity since Jesus came? When Jesus came, how many churches did he establish? Only one. And how many are there today? How many different kinds of denominations? Remember the number? 33,000, according to the World Bible Encyclopedia. 33,000 different denominations, I don't think that's what Jesus intended. I know that's not what he intended. And so we talked about, would it be important for us, labeling ourselves as members of the Church of Christ, would it be important for us to understand how that happened? Would it be important for us to understand that there's a tendency for us to do that? To group, to think in terms of to think corporately, to think in terms of groups and being part of the right group. And I made the point last week, and I'll make it again. We believe that it's not about being in the right boat. That's not what Christianity is about. What Christianity is about is being right. It's not about whose church roll you happen to be listed on. It's important that you understand that you're in the book of life. And that's an individual thing. Mark's been doing a great class on this Wednesday night on the 7 churches. And what theme do we keep seeing through the 7 churches in that regard? Because some of those churches weren't very good. They're still a remnant. And he said, those who are faithful will survive. So no matter what's going on around us, no matter what we see in the world today, even religiously with church history, we have the ability to be right with our Lord. And so that's kind of been the focus as we've been talking a little bit about church history. So I have another disclaimer. I had to write this down. I have another disclaimer that I want to make this morning because I don't want to leave the wrong impression. I talked last week about the Roman Catholic Church, and this week we're going to lead up to through the Reformation movement, up to the Restoration movement. So last week we talked about the Catholic Church, and we talked about some of how it became, and so forth. And this is the disclaimer that I want to put in our discussion this morning. I want you to know that I am not interested in judging people's hearts or their intent. All I know is what I read. And so what I'm looking at is I'm looking at their words and I'm looking at their actions. And what I'm saying is I don't know for sure what the intent was of some of these developing denominations. Maybe they really did want to do what was right. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe their heart was good, and maybe the Lord will deal with them in a way that I'm not sure how he'll deal with them, but their hearts were right. But when you listen to them talk and you read their writings and you see what they did, you get a completely different impression of maybe what they intended. And so I made the point last week, and I'm going to continue to make this point all the way up to 2018 when we get to this in a week or two, not only through the Roman Catholic Church, the development of that congregation or that religion, the Reformation movement, the Restoration movement. I want to make the point that I think one of their big problems was that people have a tendency to think corporately. And I'm saying that not because I'm judging their heart. Maybe that wasn't their intent. But that seems to be the result of what they did. And so they might say, for instance, I don't have any interest in denominationalism. I don't want to create a denomination. They might have said that. But then their action and other things that they wrote ended up creating a denomination. You understand what I'm saying? And so I don't want you to misunderstand what I'm doing. I'm not trying to judge their intent or their hearts. All I'm doing is backing away, and I think it helps us to back away and look at what they did and what actually ended up happening. And my tendency is to think that most of them were thinking corporately. And I think a lot of them were influenced by denominations they were already a part of, like the Stone Campbell movement. They came out of denominationalism. And so wouldn't they have a tendency to think that that's what the church ought to be? If you think about Luther, his effort was to reform the Catholic Church, right? And so he started with the Catholic Church and wanted to fix it. Maybe he shouldn't have started there. You know what I'm saying? And even with the Restoration movement, that's pretty much what they did. We're going to see as we talk about this next week, is that they looked at the church situation, and they said, we need to fix this. They used the word restore, but we need to fix this. And what I'm suggesting to you is that as we look through some of this history, what we're going to see is that we're going to see that they really did think, at least in their writings, it appears as though they thought corporately instead of individually. And I think that's a big mistake. I think I said that last week. I don't think we should think corporately. I don't think we should think that way. Obviously, we have to work together, and there are things we have to decide together. You know, what time are we going to meet? Where are we going to meet? What are we going to do when we meet? Those are all things we have to do together. We have to decide those things corporately. But when it's all said and done, bottom line is, I'm standing before the Lord, myself, without the church ID card. It's just me. And I'm going to have to stand an account and give an account for what I believe and what I did in this life, not what you did or somebody else did. Everybody together on that? Okay. So let me just give you this illustration because I think this is kind of important. There's a very good, I won't give you his name because you may know who he is, very famous preacher in the conservative movement of the Churches of Christ. Very important. He was a writer. He wrote actually had a paper. And we went to him one time. He happened to live in Tampa. We went to him to talk with him about his concern about what we had put on our church sign. We had put on our sign, rather than putting Church of Christ, we put on our sign all of the designations that we could find in the New Testament. Churches of Christ, Church of God, Household of God, Family of God, all the different things, and with a passage right next to each one of them. That's what we put on our sign. Well, he went ballistic. Now, he didn't worship with us, but he went ballistic. And he preached a sermon against what we did. And the point of his lesson was, they obviously don't know who they are. Well, we knew exactly who we were. And we used all these passages to let people know in the community, because of where we were, that we weren't associated with some specific denomination, that we were Christians. And so we used these and had a Bible passage by every one of them. You know, it's not like we made this stuff up. So anyway, he preached this sermon. So we went to him, and a couple of us from the congregation, and we sat down with him and said, brother, we don't understand, why you have an issue with this, because we don't believe that we want to be part of some massive organization. We want to think about what's best for our congregation and our particular part of the city. And his answer was, I won't tell you all of his answers, but his main thrust was that he felt as though the churches should all be the same. That the name on the signs should be the same. That their worship service should be the same. In fact, he went so far as to say, and I'm just sitting there and stunned, he went so far as to say that he felt that all of the churches should study out of the same workbooks and be in the same lesson every Sunday, so that if he were traveling and he went to California, he would know that out of this workbook, they were studying lesson number 3. You think he was thinking corporately? Yeah. And yet he would be the first one to tell you, I don't have a denominational, bone in my body. So my point is that sometimes we think that way, even though it's unintended. And that's what I'm trying to do, is I'm trying to look at this from the standpoint of reading their writings and saying, what impression is actually being left? What's really going on here? Yeah.
Can you explain corporate, because it's a term I've been hearing a lot lately, and when I've heard it, like, it's kind of used as far as when they come together at this time.
Yeah.
I was asking because I don't really, but
Yeah.
then the way you're saying it is kind of like, it seems like it's meaning like, kind of like denomination. But so I was just wondering, is there a real definition? Is the term I keep hearing used, and I keep hearing it used in different ways, because I really don't know.
That's a great question, Tara. I think one of the problems that we have sometimes is when we use words that are not Bible words, and so they're kind of hard to define. I'm using it accommodatively, the idea of corporate, from the standpoint of thinking corporately in my mind is thinking that there's some way that we can church universal, and that somehow everybody in that church should look the same way, sound the same way, teach the same thing. So that's the way I'm thinking about it. So I'm really using it. I'm using it instead of denominational, actually, but that's accommodatively how I'm using it. The reason is because I think that makes us think more like denominational. I think what we have a tendency to do, and you know, you may think I'm wrong about this, and that's okay, but I think we have a tendency to say, I'm not a denomination, I'm not denominational, I don't think denominationally, and yet the things that we do look that way. And so the world looks at us from the outside and they says, okay, you can say all you want that you're not a denomination, but hold on if you are, you know, because that's what you look like. So can I give you a really graphic example? I shared this with Neva this morning, so I might hear about this. What does the word Catholic mean? The word Catholic. The word itself means universal. That's what the word means. All right, you with me? The word Catholic means universal. So I propose that we put on our sign, members of the Catholic Church. Is that true?
It's a true statement, but that's not the, it's a true statement, but from the outside world, you get the.
Yeah, that'd be pretty dumb to do, wouldn't it? I'm not going to ask for a show of hands. I'm not proposing that. But my point is that sometimes we appear denominational, even though we fully understand what we're doing. We fully understand that we're not, and yet it appears to be from the outside. You with me? So that's how I'm using the word corporate. Thinking that we're a part of a larger body than just, we are a part of the larger body, but what does that look like? Do we know who those are? Yeah. All right, so with that, I guess the question that I put is, how are we portraying ourselves to others? Do we appear denominational? All right, so we looked at this chart, and this is the chart that I told you we've been following. We started last week talking a little bit about the Catholic Church, and Neve and I really struggled with this chart because in some ways it's a little misleading. You get the idea across the top here, and we put individuals who are part of the remnant. And you get the idea that all of these people that have digressed away from that are not, in fact, part of the remnant. And I'll just tell you that I think that it's pretty clear that people can serve God in a lot of different ways. And I hope you understand what I mean by that accommodatively. They can have a direct relationship with God and not all happen to be worshiping together. You with me? There are Christians all over the world, and they're doing their things. And so this just helps us in kind of a graphic way see some of the main goalposts for what happened to church in church history. So we talked last week a little bit about the Roman Catholic Church, and I'll tell you what's kind of interesting about that. We showed a couple of, talked a little bit about a couple of things, but I want to lay this foundation because I think most religions today, and this is a tendency that we would have, most religions today are rooted in the same kind of thinking that developed the Roman Catholic Church. I'll let that sink in. I think most of the religious things we see today and churches that we see today are rooted in the same kind of thinking that was the beginning of the Roman Catholic Church. And that's rooted in this idea of thinking corporately, that somehow we have to have the masses all on the same page. And I want to also tell you that I think what happened with the Roman Catholic Church is my personal opinion from my study, and I'm no expert in this, but my personal opinion from my study is that the Roman Catholic Church, I think, came out of what was Phariseeism in the Judaism religion. They thought exactly the same way. It's about externals. It's about performance. And so very, very early on, we see this contrast between a performance religion and a grace religion. What do I mean by a performance religion? I want you to be with me on this. What do I mean by a performance religion? Yeah, that's only about what you do. I'm going to use the extremes. That it's only about what you do. It's not about how you feel. It's not about where your faith is or where your heart is. It's only about doing the right thing. What's the problem with that?
What is the right thing?
Huh?
What is the right
Yeah, what is the right thing? But even if you figure it out, could you get it all right?
We're not saved by our works.
Exactly. That's absolutely, totally against what Jesus and Paul and all the apostles taught. We're not saved by our works. Our works important.
Absolutely.
Absolutely important. So I don't want to forget that. But that's not how we're saved. But how did the Pharisees see their religion in Judaism? It's about getting it right, right? Absolutely, absolutely. That's what that's why Jesus attacked the Pharisees the way he did. You know, you guys may be getting some of this right, but your heart's in the wrong place. Well, if you look at what's happened to the Roman Catholic Church and what happened early on, it was really about performance. It was about doing the right things, saying enough rosaries, going to the priest to do your confession, whatever those things were. And I mean, you know, there are a lot of jokes about it. I remember kidding about when I was really young about the ones that I knew. A lot of people, they have fun, you know, sow their wild oats on Saturday night, pray for a crop failure on Sunday morning. You know what I mean? And as long as they were doing the right thing, everything was okay. And when you take the Roman Catholic Church as it broke away, I think it fell into apostasy. Starting when? When did the Roman Catholic Church or the concepts for the Roman Catholic Church start? Do you remember? I talked about Ignatius. Remember, and Ignatius was the one who talked last week. I talked about Ignatius, who was living during the time of the apostles and decided that there should be a distinction between bishops and presbyters, and that bishops should have more control than they should. In fact, there were church bishops there were bishops that were city bishops. All of that happened in the first century. It's not like it happened in 300, 400, 500. It happened in the first century, just like Paul predicted it. And so what we see is Roman Catholicism then co-opting a few things. If you know much about their history, it was so important that they become the church, the only church, universally. That's why the word Catholic is used, universal. It was so important that they co-opted the word Christianity. In the second century, who were the Christians? Roman Catholics. Today, when you say, what did Christians think in 600 AD? What are they going to look at? Catholic Church. They co-opted that word. They took in paganism because they wanted those folks converted. And so they would take their festivals and they would give them religious meaning. Where do you think we got Easter? They would give them religious meanings so that they could pull into their discussion the pagans. They were like this to the government. In fact, they became the government in a lot of places. And so their structure is very much like government. Again, this kind of corporate, universal point of view. Well, like I said, I think a lot of that, my thinking of that it came in from the Pharisaism and Judaism. I think that's where that thinking came from. So I found this. I thought this was pretty interesting. Well, first of all, the problem with performance religions is it minimizes God's part, right? Puts it on me, doesn't put it on God. It minimizes God's part. I think it reduces the power of being pardoned and having forgiveness. It minimizes that because, again, it puts more emphasis on me than it does on God. But this idea of performance religion also turns us into lawyers. Isn't that what it did to the Pharisees? Turned them into lawyers. So I found this interesting. They started out with the 10 Commandments, right? That's how they started out with the 10 Commandments. Then the Ten Commandments became essentially the Pentateuch, which was all of the law, Exodus through Deuteronomy. You know what it became? I found this out, that this was interesting. In my Bible at home, Exodus through Deuteronomy is 196 pages. If you took all of those laws, 196 pages. The Talmud now is composed of 62,000 pages. 62,000 pages. That's what governs the Jewish law. 62,000. And so they did some pretty interesting things. A woman must not wear such headgear as would require unloosing before taking a bath, nor go out with such ornaments as could be taken off in the street, such as a frontlet, unless it is attached to the cap, nor with a gold crown, nor with a necklace or a nose ring, nor with rings, nor have a pin on her dress. The reason for this prohibition of the ornaments was that in the vanity, women might take them off to show them to their companions, and then, forgetful to the day, carry them, which would be a burden. That's one of the tractates out of 62,000 pages that they created. And I think what we see is, we see the Catholic Church, in a lot of ways, doing the same thing. As I said, it was predicted in Acts 20. Bishops were given too much power and authority. In 295, the first official use of Pope as a title for a single bishop was given, Papa. And then in 313, Constantine, through the Edict of Milan, declared religious tolerance for Christianity. And I think that was one of the worst things that happened to Christianity. And we talked about that last week, that when Diocletian was killing Christians, it wasn't easy to be a Christian. And you were a Christian because you wanted to be a Christian, because you knew your life was at stake. And as soon as Diocletian was gone and Constantine came in and said, let's make Christianity a state religion, how do you think that affected Christianity? Now it's favorable to be a Christian. In fact, and I made this point last week, Constantine even allowed bishops to become their Supreme Court. That if you had a dispute with your neighbor, and this dispute with your neighbor was settled in a regular court, and you lost, you could, if you were a Christian, appeal to your local bishop, and your local bishop would have the final say in that case. And his say was unappealable, like the Supreme Court. I think that'd be a big incentive for me to be a Christian and do whatever I needed to do to get close to the bishop. And so, in a lot of ways, Christianity, I think, was corrupted. More power was given to the church. It was popular to become a Christian. And it became so popular that they actually became extremely militant about the religion. And what did they do to heretics? Yeah. That was, I think that was a lot of that was the result of Constantine. What's interesting about that period of time, though, I'm going to just lay this little seed for you to think about, is that I think we still suffer from some of the influences of Christianity, even in our thinking of the Roman Catholic Church and what they created, even in our thinking. They thought the sanctuary was a special place. Know any Christians that think that? You know, you got to be quiet before church starts because you're in God's house. Where's God's house? You ever heard the term auricular confession? Auricular confession, you know what that means? In the ear of the priest. How do we often take confession? Come forward, sit down next to him, whisper in my ear, and I'll give it to you. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. I'm just saying that some of the stuff that we do and that we practice came from that practice. The difference between clergy and laity came from that religion. And I think we still have a tendency to think that there's something different about preachers. You know, we expect more in some ways out of the preacher's wife than we do anybody else. Why? Is she just a Christian? Anyway, those are the kind of things. I wonder sometimes how much of that we've actually taken from, or part of our history and our baggage that's hard for us to get rid of. Division persisted as a result of councils making theological decisions for the group. The absolute power of the emperor was now left in the hands of the church, and in fact, it started looking like the Roman government in its formality, bureaucratic and control. And it really did. It's really interesting. I mentioned this book before, Pagan Christianity. But if you read that book, you'll find out that a lot of the practices that you see in churches today are as a result of what was done in the Roman Catholic Church, or against what was done in the Roman Catholic Church, which was actually rooted in the Roman Empire, the way the government was set up, which is kind of interesting. So what happens later, as we move down this timeline, in 1054, there was this huge conflict going on in the churches, in the Roman Catholic Church. And as a result of centuries of councils that debated theological doctrines where positions were debated and disputed, multiple splits took place until in 1054 AD, Greek churches in southern Italy were forced to either close or conform to Latin practices. So there was this huge debate about these churches that weren't doing what Rome wanted them to do. And they said, if you don't line up, we're going to throw you out. This became known as the Great Schism and created the Eastern Orthodox movement. Those are the two heads of those movements. One the head of the Roman Catholic Church, the other head of the Greek Orthodox. But that's where that came from. Greek Orthodox were originally Roman Catholics. And so what you see is out of the Eastern Orthodox religion, the Assyrian Church, the Oriental Orthodox, a whole chain of denominations came out of that movement. But that was a result of this split. And so you ended up with a Western Church and an Eastern Church. And that was the Great Schism of 1054. It's interesting that it was immediately after this that the Western Church, which was the Roman Catholic Church, got really nervous about people not falling in line. Do you remember what happened shortly after this? In actually from 1095 to 1291, the Crusades. Where the Roman Catholic were killing people because they weren't submitting. And that's what created the whole battle between the Muslims and the Catholics. The whole Crusade movement, that was all about, well, if you're not going to get in line, rather than you starting another church, we'll just kill you. How's that? Because you're heretics anyway. And of course, that also led ultimately into the Spanish Inquisition. Early in the 1500s, there was this other Reformation. In 1517, Pope Leo X offered indulgences for those who gave alms to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The aggressive marketing practices in promoting this cause provoked Martin Luther to write his 95 Theses, condemning what he saw as the purchase and sale of salvation. What is an indulgence? What do I mean by talk about selling indulgences? You know what that means? Yeah, goodbye. They had to fund St. Peter's Basilica. It had to be built. I don't know if you've ever seen it. I haven't seen it personally, but I understand it's just unbelievably magnificent. Huge. And they had to fund that, and so they started selling indulgences, pardons. Pay a little bit of money, and you can have your sins forgiven. And, oh, by the way, you know what would be a really good idea? What if you buy pardon for the sin that you might commit next week? Buy that? Would you buy that? What if you could buy what if you could buy indulgences for sins that you might commit 20 years from now and put a price on that? What if you could buy pardon for the sins of your mother, whom you love so well, who died last week? What if you could do that? Get her out of purgatory. You see where that went? And so Martin Luther stood up and he said, hey, wait. This isn't right. This isn't right. And so it was because of that that he wrote the 95 Theses and created what actually became to be part of the Lutheran Church. That was in 1517. In 1521, the Pope, who got so fed up with him, by the way, he was a monk. So he was a part of the Roman Catholic Church. And when he wrote his 95 Theses, he was just telling them, look, what you're doing is wrong. You can't be selling pardon. In fact, I don't know if you've ever read the 95 Theses. I read it again yesterday. It's really interesting. He challenged the Pope's authority, but what he also said was, you're so rich, why don't you pay for St. Peter's Basilica? Instead of zapping the money from poor people. Almost want to say amen. And then, of course, incorporated in that 95 Theses was his belief that because, remember, he was trying to reform the church, and so he wanted to do things exactly the opposite of what the Roman Catholic Church was. If the Roman Catholic Church was a performance religion, then what would he do if he were going to the other extreme? Faith only, grace only. And that's exactly what was part of his 95 Theses, that it's only a fact of faith. That's all it takes is faith. And so what he was doing was he was reacting to something that was already in place. He finally was excommunicated in 1521 for high treason, and the Edict of Worms, which I think was really fascinating. Get this as a foundation for how to deal with heretics. The edict said that anybody who opposes the Pope and is ruled to be excommunicant, half of all of their possessions, everything that they owned, would be confiscated. Half of it would go to the church. The other half of it would go to the person who accused that person. I'm thinking I got a lot of accusations against President Trump. No. But you see where that could go? You see where that could go? And that's exactly what happened, unfortunately. And so then, from Luther, the split between the Lutherans and the Catholics was made public and clear in 1521. The Edict of Worms. The edict condemned Luther, officially banned citizens of the Holy Roman Empire from defending or propagating his ideas, subjecting advocates of Lutheranism to the forfeiture of all property. Half of the seized property would be forfeited to the government, the remaining half forfeited to the party who brought the accusation. And in 1536, then in comes Calvin. But what's interesting is that Germany would not accept the bishop's order. They didn't accept, and they were basically protecting Luther. I think that's probably why he was never killed. But they were basically protected. So here now is this big split between the German people and the Roman Catholic Church. Not only was there a philosophical difference, of course, Luther was moving down this road away from the Catholic Church, but then when Calvin comes in, Calvin, out of Calvinism, because what Calvin said was Luther didn't go far enough. He just didn't go far enough. He started, but he needed to be more strict and more vocal against the church and the structure of the church. And so he started basically teaching his own doctrine, and look what happened from him. Out of him came Anabaptists, Lutheran, Presbyterian, Congregational, a whole host of denominations came out of the Calvinist movement, which started with the Lutheran movement, Luther's movement. And then when you look up to the top here, with this break off of the Catholic Church, In 1534, why did Henry VIII get tired of the Catholic Church controlling him? You remember? Yeah, he had a dog in the fight. Yeah. He was married to somebody he didn't want to be married to. And he asked the Bishop of Canterbury to give him to go to the Pope and get the divorce, decree the divorce for him. And the Pope said, nope, not going to happen. And so he said, okay, well then I'll just start my own church. And he did, the Church of England. And it's out of the Church of England that came Episcopalianism. Did you know that? That came from Henry VIII, because he broke away from the Catholic Church. What's interesting about this particular time period, without going into a bunch of detail about this, but what's interesting is that in this particular time period, there was a huge movement of nationalism throughout the world. Everybody wanted to take care of their own country. Now, I'm not trying to make a political statement, I just want to make an observation. Our last president, President Obama, had a global view of our country. He felt like we should be more European. We were more European, they would be more like us. He had a global view. On the scene comes our current president, who says, America first. And he is more nationalistic in his point of view, right? Everybody see this? Well, that's exactly what was happening during this period of time. And so the Germans now are fighting against, the German country is now fighting against the Roman Catholic Church. Now England is saying, we're going to do our own thing. And it just exploded so that again it was fragmented into, and all of these movements, Episcopal, Methodist, Pentecostal, even a lot of the Christian movements, which we'll explain next week in more detail, Mormonism, Quakers, Baptists, Puritans, all of them came out of that movement. That's the root, that was the basis for that movement, or for those individual denominations. Are you getting the picture of what I said last week about thinking corporately and it causing us to split? And I think that's exactly what we see happening. And of course, that's really in stark contrast to, or this stark contrast, performance versus grace, which we'll notice that if, again, the Roman Catholic Church was more about performance, and then actually the Episcopal Church is more about performance too, which is kind of interesting. They kind of hung on to that from the Roman Catholic Church. Henry VIII, when he created the Church of England, it looked identical to the Roman Catholic Church. It's just he was the head of it. That was basically the difference. And so they're very much performance-oriented. When you go down and look at what happened with Luther's group, they're more faith and grace-oriented. And so you're still seeing this conflict. And you're also seeing this conflict between the church making decisions and what the Bible says. Remember we said last week that with the Roman Catholic Church, there were essentially three different ways to get authority: the Pope, tradition, and the Bible. What was the first? What was the most important of those three? Do you know? Should I say it out loud? The Pope. And back here in this split, over here in the 1500s, back here in the 1500s, one of the things that was going on as a result of this great schism was that at the current time there were three popes in the world. Three popes. All of them claimed to be perfect. All of them claimed to be the vicar of God. All of them claimed to be from Peter. Three popes. And so what happened, of course, as a result of the nationalism is that they split. It's still thinking corporately. They had to denominate. They had to name themselves. Remember, that's what the word denominate means. It means to name. And so if I decide I'm going to leave and I'm going to go start Church of Doug, what I've done is I've denominated myself, because that's what the word means, to name. They had to have a creed, something in writing, and they had to have some type of universal structure. So when I talk about corporately, and that's been kind of the history of the church in our world, that's what I'm talking about. And those are the three things that I think we need to seriously address. which we'll get to. Thanks for your attention this morning.